Yeah, we've been here before. Last year, I made a video about Dark Souls 2. This video aims to explain why I believe the game to be underrated, going over things like New Game Plus, visual designs, boss variety, and so on. That video spawned a lot of discussion about the game itself. There were a lot of people who agreed with me, and several others who didn't. Overall, I enjoyed the discussion, and it added to my perception of the game itself. One of the things I've done more recently is taken the game apart more precisely, looking at all of its parts one by one, dissecting my likes and dislikes and comparing them to others from the community. I've already droned on and on about what I like from Dark Souls 2, so I think it's about time that I covered the other side of things. It's time for me to become the inverted evil rat and say that actually, I don't like Dark Souls 2. What I aim to do this time is talk about some of the things that I believe Dark Souls 2 does wrong, the things that make it the black sheep of the series. At the end, I will explain why I chose to do this, so stick around for that. If you don't, I'd at least like for you to hear it. So if you're not interested in hearing about the faults of Dark Souls 2, then skip to this timestamp on screen. Otherwise, for the rest of you, let's dive back into Dark Souls 2. Starting out, one of the biggest nitpicks I have with Dark Souls 2 is how it handles animation timing. Last year, I talked about how this makes Dark Souls 2 feel turn-based. While I still stand by that comment, I'll change it to say that it just slows things down too much. Using any weapon will drain a specific amount of stamina and lock you in an animation. In other Souls games, you're able to force your way out of this animation at a certain point, canceling the animation and allowing you to evade attacks. Dark Souls 2 has this, albeit only slightly. Most animations in Dark Souls 2 must fully play out before you are able to do anything else. This makes sense, because that's how these things should be, but the animations in Dark Souls 2 feel so slow. This makes the impact of some weapons vary. Not quite as many of them feel like they have actual impact, just sliding off an enemy while doing damage. It makes the moment-to-moment combat feel unsubstantial despite being much like the combat of the other titles. One of the biggest complaints I hear about is adaptability. Despite it being a big complaint from the community, I believe it to be at least somewhat passable despite its issues. But that doesn't mean I won't identify those issues. Adaptability is a stat that is tied to agility, or how fast you do certain things. This does everything from increasing your dodge iframes to making it so you can drink Estus faster. This is the biggest complaint about adaptability. Agility is the big kicker here, not adaptability itself. This system on paper sounds alright. It gives more variety and specialization to builds that may want to utilize more adept movement. In practice though, it falls completely flat, being a chore to work around if you want to make your movements feel good in any way. This one stat can make or break a playthrough, taking what is normally just baked-in control and making it completely up to the player if they want it or not. The biggest issue with it being how obscure it really is. The way the stat describes itself would make you think that it doesn't control most of the stuff that it controls, being overly ambiguous in its nature as a stat. These two things are small in the scheme of issues Dark Souls 2 has, though that depends on who you are as a player. These following issues are ones that I believe hold much more weight into the discussion of what Dark Souls 2 does wrong. Dark Souls 2's enemies are something I've complained about before, though I want to dive more into them as there are a lot of issues with them in the game. The first and biggest issue with them is their placement. Now, I will admit, some of the enemy placement in Dark Souls 2 isn't awful. The game does pay attention to where things go and when, though I can't say it does this well each and every time. Some areas have placement that makes luring enemies out one by one nearly impossible. Other areas have placement that is simply just infuriating. The one place that stands out in my mind now is the Shrine of Amana. I'm not sure what it's like in vanilla, but the shrine in Scholar Edition has far too much going on in it. You can't walk more than 2 feet without being spammed by the mages and being attacked by those frog things. The worst placement by far though is this section right here. This is the bonfire before the area boss. In order to continue through the area, you have to kill some poison broomers. The problem, these things spray mist that degrades your armor extremely fast, meaning that you have to strip your gear off completely in order to avoid breaking all of them before continuing. This isn't avoidable. You either take the durability damage or do what I mentioned, strip down and start slashing. This is what I would personally say is the worst placement in the entire game. There are plenty of other bad placements as well, but nothing nearly as egregious as this. The area as a whole is just a slog to get through. I feel this way about a lot of Dark Souls 2's areas. For as pretty as they look, the way you navigate them can sometimes feel bad. I never look forward to areas like the Shrine of Amana or the Undead Crypt. It's spaces like these that make me want to avoid replaying the game. So much of this is just enemy placement. Seldora as a whole is an area I could do without, but for the most part is inoffensive. The worst example in this area is the lower section where you encounter the second boss weapon vendor. This area is short, but when you're in it, you are constantly bombarded by enemies. The bonfire is right next to a nest of spiders that immediately approach you when you get up. Then outside, you have more spiders and 2 near infinite ranged casters that will hit you while you are avoiding the spiders. Then, if it couldn't get worse, your ability to navigate the area and effectively avoid these threats is impacted. By what, you may ask? Well, by a huge sand whirlpool that takes up a third of the entire area and is right next to the threats you need to deal with. Black Gulch may be my least favorite area in the base game, but that's because you have to go through it. The only saving grace of this area is that it's entirely optional. Now, I say that, but Seldora itself isn't actually optional at all. Only this one part of Seldora is. And that's another thing that Dark Souls 2 messes up with. Besides some places within areas you don't typically go, the game doesn't really have any truly optional areas. There's no Painted World of Ariandel here, there's no Archdragon Peak. The vast majority of Dark Souls 2's areas are required to go through to complete the game. Now, like I said, there are things hidden in these areas that are optional, but the main areas themselves are not. Going through the game a second time, I never felt like there was any secret hidden for me behind a wall. There were no cool areas left to find. I had seen it all on the first run. There are very few true optional areas in Dark Souls 2, but I can only really say that one of them is actually an area. The others are just half-baked mini-jaunts that take less than 10 minutes to complete. These little optional areas being places like the 2 belfries, the various giant memories, the Dark Chasm of Old, and some other areas that serve as boss arenas. These areas being places like the Cathedral of Blue or the Undead Purgatory. The only area in this game that I feel is truly an optional area is No Man's Wharf. No Man's Wharf is a bit tricky as an optional area though, because many people will find themselves here during their playthroughs. That, and it does allow you to progress through the game normally. Even with this though, you do not need to go to No Man's Wharf to beat Dark Souls 2. The area itself is just another path to the Lost Bastille, though if you want to skip the Ruin Sentinels, then you do need to go through this area. In the same sense, the Forest of the Fallen Giants would be the same, the issue being that you need to go through that area to reach the Memory of Jay, this being the only memory in the game that isn't optional. The reason I bring this up as a con is because Dark Souls 2 reveals all of its cards to you. It holds few secrets, and those secrets, while sometimes cool, are very shallow in their execution. Many of the optional areas of Dark Souls 2 lead to underwhelming bosses or shortcuts that are more pain than they're worth. It's such a shame that there aren't more optional areas in the game, as it would give me more of a reason to explore these areas. It sucks even more because there are a lot of optional bosses in Dark Souls 2, and many of them are really good. If there was more of a focus towards making truly optional areas, then I'd feel more inclined to explore the great areas this game has. But without them, I often find myself skipping large chunks of an area, doing so out of a lack of reward. Speaking of optional things, technically you can force things to be optional. In fact, you don't need any of the Lord Souls to beat the game. This can be done through exploiting soul memory, getting yourself to 1 million souls and bypassing the entire first half of the game. I do not recommend this option at all, but it exists. Soul memory is something that I feel is a divisive feature for Dark Souls 2 fans. Either you hate it or love it, though many people will just never realize it's there. As it stands though, this mechanic isn't good, and there is one big reason as to why. It directly interferes with the way co-op works. Soul memory is the total count of souls you've collected throughout your playthrough, meaning anytime you've collected souls, they get added to this number. This only includes souls you've collected for the first time, so no, you can't farm this by dying with thousands of souls and getting them back from your bloodstain. By itself, the system isn't bad. Underwhelming and slightly unnecessary maybe, but bad? No, not really. The thing that makes it a detriment to the game is how it affects online play. If you're like me, then you likely only ever play the game alone, but for those of you who enjoy some jolly cooperation, then this is a system that you likely hate. How soul memory works with summoning or invading is like this. Depending on your soul memory, you will be placed into a tier. This tier will only ever go up. These tiers are what govern who you can summon and who can summon you. Summoning or invading items work within these tiers, varying in how far up and how far back they go. What I mean by this is that items have different ranges they meet. For example, if you're at, say, tier 10 and you use a white soapstone, then you can be summoned by someone 3 tiers lower than you or 1 tier higher. Then, if you were to use the small white soapstone, you'd be able to reach to players 4 tiers lower and 2 tiers higher. The reason this is so bad is that you need to be aware of this if you plan on doing any form of online co-op or invading. To actually engage with other people in the game, this is required to understand. That's why you'll see things like SM 1.2 million on LFG posts for summoning. It indicates who can actually help that person. If you were to play with a friend and want to farm souls for levels, then you have to be aware of how many souls you get so you don't accidentally leave their memory range. Or if you want to respond to LFG requests, then you're limited to whatever is in your character's specific range. You'd think the name engraved ring would make this better, but you'd be mistaken. All this ring does is slap a fat +3 to each side of the memory range. This does help a ton with the tedium of soul memory, as you shouldn't really ever be more than 7 tiers above someone else, let alone 5. But the limiting factors are still in place. It's just not a good system. I know that none of the Souls games have really nailed the co-op system, even Elden Ring is still rocking similar issues, but at least that game doesn't restrict you by limiting who can summon you, it just knocks you to their level, balancing everything instead of preventing you from engaging with the system in the first place. That's the biggest issue with soul memory. It's not a feature, it's a limitation, a preventative factor that impedes play instead of encouraging it. I'm glad this didn't stick around because it's just awful. And with that, here we are, the final issue. The big one, as one might call it. This entire list has mostly been subjective. Some people might not mind a lack of optional areas or the limitations of soul memory, but those do hold down this game. This final issue is one that I have personally. The biggest issue that I have with Dark Souls 2, the thing that hurts it the most in my opinion, is that it just doesn't take itself seriously enough. Now, don't get me wrong, Dark Souls 2 does take itself seriously. It is by far one of the most innovative Souls titles. It presents a lot of new things to the formula. It's not afraid to experiment and try new things. It's just that with what it does try, it doesn't feel like Dark Souls 2 really tried enough. Things like adaptability and soul memory are a great example of this. Systems that could have been just fine if they were more fleshed out and used for different purposes, but they feel unfinished, like they were meant to be more, but weren't. With soul memory specifically, it feels like it was meant to be something that helped out in New Game Plus, allowing you to get to the mid-game as fast as possible. This can be seen with the Shrine of Winter, but that's not how it turned out. New Game Plus as well is one of the worst examples of Dark Souls 2 not going nearly into depth as it could have, or arguably, as it should have. New Game Plus in Dark Souls 2 is far more developed than in any other Souls game. The issue is that it's only like this thanks to the bonfire aesthetics, combining New Game and New Game Plus together. New Game Plus by itself is just as underwhelming as any other Souls game with very limited exceptions. Those exceptions, though, shine a light at what could have been a new, unique experience. One that encourages you to blast through the game again, taking on new challenges and overcoming Dark Souls 2 once more, perhaps with a new perspective on the game. Its enemy placement, the build variety, the bosses, all of it. But unfortunately, it's not there. Instead, we get to refight bosses and have a mid-ear encounter with the Duke's Dear Freya. And as cool as that is, there could have been so much more. It feels like Dark Souls 2 had too many ideas to try and not enough time to try them. It feels unfinished in a way that is very different from Dark Souls. This doesn't end with those things. This issue makes its way into everything I've talked about in this video. The optional areas that are super small feel forgotten, like they were supposed to be more impactful, bigger than what they are, but instead got stuck filling in a role as a bonus zone. Areas that feel meant for things like covenants, but instead are breeze-throughs that hardly anyone will ever care for. Enemy placement by itself feels off, like they designed too many enemies but not enough space for them, so they jumbled them together or placed them in a checkpoint fashion instead of making them feel diegetic to their space. If these things were roped down more, managed and balanced, if time had been allocated for them to be better, then maybe, just maybe, it could have worked. When I say Dark Souls 2 doesn't take itself seriously, I do mean it. It feels like the game looks at everything it tries and feels bad about them, but not so bad that those things get removed. If anything else, it feels like Dark Souls 2 tries too much, and not hard enough. That is the biggest issue plaguing Dark Souls 2. Dark Souls 2 doesn't entirely fail at this. It is a fun game with good aspects. It just fails so hard at effectively meeting the expectations it sets for itself. It checks off some, but not all of the boxes to make it a high enjoyment Souls title, and as such is primarily why I believe the game to be so divisive. Dark Souls 2, even after everything I've said, after both this video and my previous one, is a good game. It is fun to play, it's beautiful to traverse, it has some incredible highs and some terrible lows, but so do all of the Souls games. The reason I sought out to make this video, the reason I dug into Dark Souls 2 negatively, I did it to show a different perspective of the game. It is perfectly okay to dissect a game you enjoy, or anything for that matter. It allows you to see things you otherwise might be blind to, allowing you to avoid being the kind of person who loves something but ignores its faults. For me, it allows me to find aspects of the game I never would have noticed in the first place. It enlightens me on the various things that make Dark Souls 2 what it is, and most of all, it helps me to better realize why I enjoy it so much. Without breaking down adaptability, I never would have realized just how specialized builds could be in Dark Souls 2. Without digging into New Game Plus, I never would have discovered just how cool the aesthetics are, how much importance they place on the bonfires, and how much the other Souls titles lack in the form of New Game Plus. I guess what I meant last year when I said that we should embrace the flaws was that we should see them for what they are, allow them to be criticized, that way you don't become blind to them. Allow these flaws to bring up the game's highlights, live with them, acknowledge them, don't forget them, just don't ignore them. That way you can learn what a game does poorly, and as a result, what it does well. I like Dark Souls 2, that much is true. And for those of you who watched this and felt betrayed because I didn't praise it for 17 minutes, I understand. I still stand by everything I said in my previous video. While I definitely could have worded that video better, I don't disagree with any of my points. So believe me, I'm still on your side. Video game critique, or just critique in general, is built on the foundation of pros and cons. There is no perfect game, just like there is no perfect movie, no perfect anything. So my final message for today is to see the flaws in everything, but don't dwell on them. For every video about a criminally underrated game, there should always be one about what went wrong.